The sound of the water was a quiet insult. It was not the gush of a river or the splash of a full trough, but a patient, maddening trickle. A sound that spoke of a deep and endless supply in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. It spilled from a pipe driven into the earth, pooling in a stone-lined basin where a shaggy gray donkey drank with slow, deliberate swallows. 26 others stood nearby, their ears twitching in the baked afternoon air, their placid dignity a stark contrast to the 3 men standing at the fence line. Their lips were cracked, their faces masked in dust, and their eyes held the particular glare of men whose authority had evaporated with the last of the town's water. Mr. Sterling, who owned the biggest ranch and the deepest well for 50 miles, cleared his throat. The sound was like stones grinding together. "Ilara," he began, his voice a rasp of false reason. "The council has decided. For the good of the community, the well must be placed under town authority." Ilara stood on her side of the fence, her hands resting on the rough timber. She was not a large woman, and the sun had fined her down to bone and sinew, but she stood as if rooted to the spot where the water came up from the ground. She did not look at Sterling, but at the donkey drinking its fill. "It is on my land, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice as quiet as the water. "Then sell the land. We will pay a fair price." "What you consider fair," she said, finally turning her gaze on him, "has changed since last week." One of the other men, the mayor, shifted his weight. "This is a drought, woman, an emergency. You cannot be allowed to hoard what everyone needs to survive." He gestured at the placid grazing animals. "You're watering livestock while children are thirsty." Ilara's gaze swept over her herd. 27 fools, the town had called them. 27 burdens. 27 signs of a woman's poor judgment. They looked back at her with soft, dark eyes, their long ears framing the sky. "They are not hoarding," she said. "They are the ones who asked for the water." The men stared, baffled by her calm, by her refusal to be cowed. They saw a stubborn woman standing before a freak of nature. They did not see the months of labor, the ridicule, the cold arithmetic of survival she had calculated alone in the dark. They could not hear the echo of the laughter that had followed her through the streets. 6 months earlier, the dust had been just as thick, but the laughter had been thicker. It had followed her from the moment she took possession of the quarter section left to her by a distant, unknown uncle. A piece of land so worthless it was known only as the Scrabble. It was a hard pan of cracked clay and thirsty mesquite, a place where the sun came to practice its cruelty. It had no well, no creek, and no hope. To the people of Redemption, a town that clung to the banks of a dwindling river, the Scrabble was a joke, and Ilara, its new owner, was the punchline. A young woman alone, with no family and no backing, saddled with land that even the coyotes seemed to shun. She was a puzzle they solved with pity and scorn. The laughter found its loudest voice the day the donkeys arrived. They were the ragged end of a long, failed cattle drive, the property of a man whose spirit had been broken somewhere in the vast, waterless expanse to the west. He had limped into Redemption with his last few steers and this sorry herd of 27 donkeys, their ribs like barrel staves under dusty hides, their heads hanging low with a thirst so profound it seemed to have settled in their very bones. He'd sold the cattle to Sterling for a pittance and was left with the burros nobody wanted. He offered them for $1 a head at the edge of town, a desperate plea to be rid of the burden before they collapsed. The townsfolk gathered to watch the spectacle. Sterling was there, sitting tall on his fine bay horse, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's anyone to do with a herd of thirsty fools?" he drawled, loud enough for all to hear. cost you more in water than they're worth in meat, and that's not saying much." The drover's face was a mask of defeat. "They're good stock, just thirsty." It was then that Alara stepped forward. She had been at the mercantile, buying the last of the flour and beans she could afford with the thin roll of bills left to her. She had heard the talk, the casual cruelty of it, and had walked to the edge of town to see for herself. She looked at the animals, at their drooped ears and dust-caked muzzles. But she saw something else in their dark, patient eyes. It was not foolishness. It was a deep and abiding stillness, a kind of endurance the men on their horses could not comprehend. "I'll take them," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmuring crowd. Sterling actually laughed. "You, miss? You'd have done better to buy a shovel and dig your own grave on that patch of dirt you own. At least that'd be useful." Alara ignored him. She looked at the desperate drover. "All of them. $27. It was nearly every cent she had left in the world. The man's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a flood of relief. "Sold," he stammered, barely able to get the word out. The transaction was a swift, grim affair. Alara counted the worn bills into his hand. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their scorn curdling into a kind of morbid fascination. A woman alone, buying a herd of dying animals to put on a piece of dying land. It was a tragedy so perfect, it was almost comical. As she turned to lead the first donkey by its frayed rope halter, Sterling's voice stopped her. "We'll call them Sterling's Folly," he announced to the crowd, who chuckled in appreciation. "A monument to bad decisions." Alara did not turn back. She did not offer a retort. She simply tugged the rope, and the lead donkey, after a moment's hesitation, followed. One by one, the others fell into a slow, shuffling line behind him. The long walk to the Scrabble was a silent parade of misery, with the town's judgment following her like a shadow. She had made her choice. She had bought 27 thirsty souls and tied her fate to theirs. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. 28 mouths to feed, with no water and almost no money. It was, by any sane measure, the act of a fool. The first week was a testament to the brutal physics of thirst. Her land offered nothing but shade from a few skeletal trees. The water had to be hauled from the public tap in town, 1.5 miles each way. Alara owned 2 buckets and a yoke her uncle had left in the leaning shed that passed for a barn. Each trip yielded 10 gallons. The donkeys, in their deep dehydration, seemed able to drink endlessly. She made the journey 10, 12, 14 times a day. Her world shrank to the path between the Scrabble and the town tap. The weight of the full buckets cutting into her shoulders, the maddening slosh of the water, the lightness of the empty buckets on the return, a lightness that felt like failure. Her hands, soft from a life she'd left behind, blistered, then broke, then hardened into calloused leather. The townsfolk watched her come and go. They offered no help, only shakes of their heads and muttered pities that sounded more like accusations. She was a living parable of their own good sense. She became a creature of pure labor, rising before the sun had bleached the color from the sky and falling into her cot after dark, her muscles screaming a protest that she learned to ignore. She measured her life in buckets. She did the math in her head as she walked. 27 donkeys, plus herself. So many gallons per day. So much flour left. So many days until her money for the town tap ran out. The numbers were a litany of despair, but she refused to let them settle. She would just have to work harder. She began to learn the donkeys. They were not a single gray mass, but individuals. There was a big, placid male with one ear that flopped down, a young Jenny with a white star on her forehead, and an old, scarred male who seemed to be the silent patriarch of the herd. They learned her too. They learned the sound of her footsteps, the rhythm of her work. When they saw her coming with the yoke, they would lift their heads and watch, their customary stillness breaking with a flicker of anticipation. They would wait their turn at the troughs she'd fashioned from hollowed logs, drinking without greed or panic. Their patience was a quiet lesson. One afternoon, as she was rubbing salve into her raw shoulders, a visitor appeared at her fence. She was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her back bent from a lifetime of work. It was Mrs. Anna, who lived on a small plot a few miles away, a woman the town treated with a mixture of respect and suspicion. She was from the old country and kept to herself, speaking in a thick, gentle accent. She leaned on the fence, watching the donkeys for a long time. Ilara, wary of more pity, stood silently. Finally, Mrs. Anna spoke, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They are not foolish, child," she said, her eyes on the animals. "They are patient." Ilara said nothing, merely nodding. "In my country," Mrs. Anna continued, "the donkey is a wise animal. It knows things the horse is too proud to learn. It knows the earth." She pointed a gnarled finger at the herd. "They are listening. Do you know what they listen for?" Ilara shook her head. Mrs. Anna smiled, a slow, deep smile that seemed to come from a place of ancient knowledge. "The desert remembers the sea," she said, the words an aphorism, a piece of poetry in the dry air. "It remembers the rivers that ran before we were born. The water is still there, sleeping. You only have to ask it nicely." It made no sense, and yet it planted a seed in the barren ground of Ilara's exhaustion. She looked at her donkeys, not as 27 burdens, but as 27 listeners, their long ears tuned to a secret frequency she could not hear. That night, for the first time, her arithmetic included a new variable, one she couldn't quantify. The possibility that she was not alone in her work, that her foolish purchase held a wisdom she had yet to understand. After 2 weeks of relentless watering, a change came over the herd. Their hides lost their dusty pallor, and a little flesh began to soften the sharp angles of their bones. The profound, deathly thirst was gone, replaced by a settled contentment. And with that contentment came curiosity. They began to explore the scrabble, not with the frantic energy of hungry animals, but with a slow, methodical purpose. They paced the boundaries of their new home, sniffing the air, nudging rocks with their soft muzzles. Ilara watched them whenever she could spare a moment from her hauling. She was beginning to think of them not as her burden, but as her strange, quiet family. One morning, she noticed something new. A small group, led by a sturdy Jenny with intelligent eyes, had congregated in the lowest part of her property, a wide, shallow basin that looked like the bed of a long, vanished creek. The lead Jenny was not grazing. She was scraping at the baked earth with her front hoof, a deliberate, rhythmic pawing. After a few minutes, she would stop, lower her head, and sniff intently at the spot she had cleared. Then she would begin again. Ilara watched, intrigued. It was not the random digging of a bored animal. It had the feeling of work. By midday, 2 other donkeys had joined the Jenny, taking turns scraping at the same spot. The patch of disturbed earth grew from a scuff to a shallow bowl. The mockery from the town, which had quieted to a low hum, found a new subject. Riders passing on the track that skirted her property would stop and stare, then ride back to town with the news. "Ilara's donkeys have gone mad," they'd report at the mercantile. "They're trying to dig their way out of that dust bowl." The story was a welcome diversion in a town growing tense from the heat and the lack of rain. A new name was born for her herd, Ilara's Digging Fools. The name carried with it a fresh wave of pity for the poor woman who had yoked herself to a pack of insane animals. It was around this time that the boy appeared. His name was Finn, a scrawny child of 10 with eyes that saw everything and a silence that suggested he'd already seen too much. He was one of the town's forgotten children, living with a tired aunt who had too many of her own. He started by watching from a distance, a small, still figure perched on a rock outside her fence. Ilara, accustomed to being watched, ignored him at first. But he kept coming back, day after day. He wasn't watching her. He was watching the donkeys. One afternoon, she found him standing right at the fence line, his gaze fixed on the digging animals in the basin. "What are they doing?" he asked, his voice a little rusty from disuse. "I'm not sure," Ilara admitted. "They think they're looking for something." "Water," the boy said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "My granda said animals can smell water under the ground." He pointed at the lead Jenny. "That one's the boss. She started it." Ilara smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in weeks. "I think you're right." From then on, Finn was a regular presence. He was quiet company, and his simple faith in the donkeys was a balm to her spirit. He gave them names. The lead Jenny became Digger. The big male with the floppy ear was Silas. A small, scrappy one was named Pebble. He named all 27 of them, and his litany of their names was a kind of prayer that humanized the herd and sharpened Ilara's own affection for them. Together, the woman and the boy would watch the slow, patient excavation, a silent partnership formed around the stubborn hope of a handful of foolish animals. The digging became the central rhythm of life on the Scrabble. Every morning, Digger would lead a crew of 5 or 6 others to the basin, and they would resume their work. The hole deepened with astonishing slowness. It was a foot deep, then 2. The clay was baked hard as rock, and the donkey's hooves could only chip away small fragments at a time. The pile of excavated dirt beside the hole grew into a small mound. The work was methodical, unhurried, and utterly relentless. To anyone else, it was madness. To Ilara and Finn, it was an act of faith. The town's amusement settled into a kind of permanent fixture. "How's the mine coming along, Ilara?" men would call out when she was at the town tap. "Struck gold yet?" She never answered, just filled her buckets and began the long walk home, her silence a more powerful reply than any argument. Being right, she was beginning to learn, is its own kind of reply. She kept doing her arithmetic. The stack of coins in the jar was shrinking. The sacks of flour and beans were growing lighter. The drought was worsening, and the town council had started talking about rationing water from the tap, which would be a death sentence. The numbers were closing in on her. Hope was not a currency the mercantile accepted. One evening in late August, after a day so hot it felt like the sky was a physical weight, she walked down to the basin. The hole was now nearly 3 feet deep, a proper pit. The donkeys were grazing peacefully nearby. Finn had gone home. In the fading light, she knelt by the edge of the hole, her body aching with fatigue. She lowered her hand into the cool darkness at the bottom, and she felt it. It was not water. It was not even mud. It was a faint, undeniable dampness, a coolness that did not come from the evening air, but from the earth itself. The soil at the very bottom was dark and clung to her fingers. She brought her hand to her face and smelled it. It was the scent of deep earth, of minerals, of life hidden from the sun. A jolt went through her, so powerful it was like a physical blow. It had worked. Or it was beginning to work. She scrambled out of the hole, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked around, suddenly fearful, as if someone might have seen, might steal this tiny, fragile secret. She kept it to herself like a coal banked low under ash, a spark of heat that no one else could see. She didn't even tell Finn. It was too new, too delicate to be exposed to the world. The next morning, she took the shovel and pickaxe from the shed and went down to the hole. When Finn arrived, he found her deep in the pit, her face grim with determination, swinging the pickaxe into the hard clay. The donkeys stood around the edge, watching her with what looked like serene approval. Without a word, the boy grabbed the smaller spade and began clearing the loosened dirt she broke free. They were no longer just watching. They had joined the work. The woman, the boy, and the 27 donkeys digging for a memory in the desert. The damp patch became a muddy seep. For a week, that was all it was, a dark, sticky clay at the bottom of a 5-foot hole. But it was enough. The donkeys, led by Digger, would delicately lip the moisture from the clay, their thirst quenched by the earth itself. It was not a flow, but it was water. And it meant Ilara no longer had to make the last few trips to town each day. The savings were small, but they were everything. She and Finn kept digging, widening the hole, shoring up the sides with rocks they gathered from the Scrabble's unforgiving surface. Then, one morning, they arrived to find a puddle. It was no bigger than a dinner plate and only an inch deep, but it was clear, standing water. A perfect, impossible mirror reflecting the pale morning sky. Ilara dropped to her knees and touched it with her fingertips. It was cold, clean, real. The arithmetic in her head suddenly shifted. The countdown to starvation and failure had been paused. That afternoon brought an unexpected test. A heavy freight wagon, its canvas cover bleached white by the sun, had broken an axle on the track a quarter-mile from her fence. The driver, a merchant named Gable, walked to her property, his face a mask of frustration. He was a man accustomed to schedules and solutions, and the featureless landscape offered him neither. His 2 big draft horses were suffering badly in the heat. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I see you have water for your stock. My team is about done for. I'd be willing to pay for a barrel or 2. He gestured toward the trough she kept near the shed. Ilara hesitated. Her instinct for secrecy warred with the sight of the man's desperation. "That's rainwater," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "It's nearly gone." "Anything," he pleaded, "just enough to get them to town." Then his eyes fell on the activity in the basin, where Finn was digging and several donkeys stood observing. "What in creation is that?" Ilara saw no way to hide it. "It's a seep," she said simply. Gable walked to the edge of the hole and peered down. He saw the muddy sides, the small puddle at the bottom. He scoffed. "You're watering your animals from a mud puddle?" "The water is clean," she said, her voice steady. He looked from the pitiful hole to his suffering horses and back again. Desperation won. "Fine," he sighed. "Fill a bucket. I'll see for myself." Ilara lowered a bucket on a rope, drawing it up half full of clear, cold water, leaving the silt at the bottom undisturbed. She handed it to him. He looked at it suspiciously, then sniffed it. He took a tentative sip. His eyes widened. He took another, deeper drink. "My word," he said, his voice full of disbelief. "That's the sweetest, coldest water in this entire territory. It tastes like it came from the snows." He looked at her, then at the donkeys, his expression shifting from pity to awe. "How?" "They found it," she said, nodding at the herd. He shook his head slowly, taking in the scene. He pulled a heavy silver dollar from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "For 2 barrels," he said. And I'll thank you not to tell anyone in town I was desperate enough to drink from a donkey ditch." But his tone held no mockery, it held respect. As he left, hauling the precious barrels back to his wagon, Ilara looked at the coin in her palm. It was heavy, real, the first money the Scrabble had ever earned. It wasn't just $1, it was proof. The sky became a brass lid screwed tight over the world. The sun was not a source of light, but a relentless physical presence, hammering the life out of the land. The river shrank to a muddy brown ribbon, and the smaller creeks that fed it vanished, leaving behind cracked gray scars. The drought, which had been a worry, became a crisis. It was a quiet, creeping disaster that frayed nerves and shortened tempers. The town's wells, which had always been reliable, began to falter. The first to go were the shallow private wells, then the public tap, where Ilara had hauled so many buckets, was restricted to 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening. Finally, the talk turned to Sterling's well. It was the deepest and most powerful in the county, sunk deep into the aquifer that fed the river. It was the source of his wealth, the engine of his cattle operation, and the town's last hope. But even Sterling's well could not defy the sky. The gush from its steam-powered pump slowed to a steady flow, then to a dispiriting trickle. The panic in Redemption became a palpable thing, a low hum of fear in the general store, a desperate edge to the prayers in church. The laughter that had once followed Ilara was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling, a watchful, suspicious silence. People no longer saw a fool, they saw a woman with water. Her small, donkey-dug well, fed by its secret source, continued to produce its slow, steady supply. It was not a torrent, but it was constant. It filled her troughs and her own barrels, a small, miraculous island of life in a dying landscape. The sight of her healthy, placid animals became an affront to those whose own stock were beginning to sicken and fail. One evening, a rider appeared at her fence. It was Sterling. He dismounted and leaned against the rails, affecting an air of neighborly concern. "Evening, Ilara," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Hard times." "They are," she agreed, not inviting him in. "I've been thinking about you," he went on. "A woman alone, with all this responsibility." He gestured vaguely toward the well. "It must be a great burden, managing the animals, the water. It's too much for one person." Ilara waited. "I've come to make you a generous offer," he said, getting to the point. "I'll buy this land from you, pay you double what the assessors say it's worth. You could take the money, move to a nicer place back east, leave all this trouble behind." He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. He didn't want the land, she knew that. He wanted the water. He wanted to own the miracle, to put his pump on it and drain it dry for his cattle, leaving nothing for anyone else. He saw her silence as hesitation, as the weakness of a woman unaccustomed to business. "It's a fair offer," he pressed. "More than fair." Ilara looked past him, to the dust devils dancing on the horizon. "The price isn't right, Mr. Sterling," she said quietly. His smile vanished. "Don't be a fool, woman. An offer like this won't come again." "I'm sure it won't," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold with a fury he could barely contain. Then he turned, swung himself onto his horse, and rode away without another word, leaving a cloud of angry dust hanging in the air. The offer had been a warning. The time for false concern was over. A week later, the pump at Sterling's well coughed, sputtered, and sucked air. It was dry. The news spread through Redemption like a grass fire, and the low hum of panic became a roar. The town was officially out of water. Sterling, his power base threatened, immediately went on the offensive. He couldn't own Alara's water, so he would poison it with words. He began to whisper in the right ears, the mayor, the councilmen, the merchants to whom he extended credit. He spoke of the natural order of things, of how one small, unnatural well could be draining the entire water table. He used words like unwholesome and witchery, planting seeds of superstition in the fertile ground of fear. He spoke of the public good, arguing that such a vital resource could not be left in the hands of a lone, unpredictable woman. The mood in town turned ugly. The looks Alara got were no longer suspicious. They were hostile. She stopped going for supplies, making do with what she had. Her small patch of land became a fortress, with Finn as her only ally and 27 donkeys as her silent, watchful guard. The real test of her resolve came not from Sterling, but from a neighbor. His name was Jed, a farmer whose land bordered hers to the south. He had been one of the loudest mockers, a man who had laughed heartily at the tale of Sterling's folly. Now, his corn was withered to brown stalks, and his 2 milk cows were lowing with a painful, constant thirst. One evening, he appeared at her fence, not on a horse, but on foot. He did not stand tall, but held the rails for support, his head bowed. His pride was a ruin. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with shame, my family, my girls are thirsty. The cows." He couldn't finish. He just stood there, a man broken by the sky. This was the moment she had foreseen in her dark calculations. This was the true arithmetic. She could turn him away. She could savor the victory. She could demand a ruinous price and watch him squirm. The town had offered her no kindness. Why should she offer any in return? She looked at his slumped shoulders, at the desperation that had stripped him of his bluster, and she saw not an enemy, but a neighbor. She saw a man afraid for his children. She unlatched the gate. "Bring your barrels, Jed," she said, her voice even and calm. "The price is a side of beef when the rains come and your herd is healthy again, and 2 quarts of milk a week for the boy." Jed looked up, his eyes filled with a stunned, profound gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. He fetched his barrels, and Alara and Finn worked the hand pump they had rigged over the well, filling them to the brim. He did not meet her eyes as he loaded them onto his wagon, but as he left, he turned back and said, "Thank you, Alara." The words were quiet, but they echoed across the silent, thirsty land. One of the councilmen, riding by on the track, saw the entire exchange. He saw the desperate neighbor. He saw the water given freely. He saw the act of grace. The story he told in town that night was not the one Sterling had been spreading. The confrontation, when it came, was as formal and brittle as old paper. Sterling did not come alone. He brought the mayor and 2 other councilmen, a delegation of parched authority. They stood at her fence line, the same spot where Sterling had made his offer, the same spot where Jed had pleaded for help. They had come to deliver an ultimatum, dressed up as a civic ordinance. This was the scene from 6 months in the future, now made real. The trickle of water from the pipe was the only sound in the tense silence. "Alara," the mayor began, avoiding her eyes. "The council has decided. For the good of the community, the well must be placed under town authority." It was Sterling's voice coming from the mayor's mouth. Alara stood her ground, Finn a small, defiant shadow at her side. The donkeys, grazing nearby, seemed to form a protective crescent behind her. She met the mayor's gaze until he looked away. "This well is on my land," she stated. "It was my animals who found it, my labor that dug it." "This is an emergency," another councilman blustered. "People are suffering. You cannot be allowed to hoard what everyone needs. I am not hoarding, Ilara said. I gave water to Jedediah Cobb yesterday. I didn't ask for cash. The man who had witnessed it nodded reluctantly. Sterling stepped forward, taking control. This is not about charity, it is about management. A resource this vital needs proper oversight. We will install a steam pump, manage distribution fairly. And what will you charge? Ilara asked. A modest fee, to cover the cost of the equipment, Sterling said smoothly. Of course, everyone there knew what Sterling's modest fee meant. It meant he would control the water, and therefore, the town. There is no need for your equipment, Ilara said. She took a breath, the words she had practiced in her mind finally ready. I will sell water to any citizen of Redemption. The price is 25 cents a barrel, the same for everyone. Jedediah Cobb, the mayor. Even you, Mr. Sterling. A gasp went through the small delegation. It was a perfectly fair price. It was generous, and it completely stripped Sterling of his power. He could not argue it was gouging. He could not argue it was hoarding. He was furious. This is absurd, he sputtered. You and a boy, filling barrels by hand? You can't possibly supply the whole town. It's an inefficient, foolish plan. It is my plan, she said. It was then that he made his mistake. His rage and frustration broke through his careful facade. You filled 3 barrels for Cobb and 2 for yourself yesterday, he snapped. 5 barrels. The town needs 100. How can you possibly... He stopped, realizing what he had said. A dead silence fell. Ilara looked at him, her expression calm, her voice dangerously quiet. How did you know the count, Mr. Sterling? She asked. How did you know how many barrels I filled for a private neighbor on my own land? Were you watching my home? Sterling's face went pale, then red. He had exposed himself. He had been spying on her, waiting for her to fail, plotting to take what was hers. The other men looked at him, then at Ilara. They saw not a fool or a witch, but a woman who had been clear-eyed and fair, and a wealthy rancher who had been revealed as a greedy, manipulative bully. His authority, like his well, had just run dry. The mayor was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat and looked at Ilara, truly seeing her for the first time. 25 cents a barrel, he said, testing the words. That is more than fair. He pulled a coin from his pocket. I'll take 4 barrels myself. And so it began. The town council left, leaving Sterling standing alone in the dust, his face a thunderous mask of humiliation. The news of the confrontation and Ilara's offer spread faster than the drought itself. Within an hour, the first wagon appeared at her gate, and then another, and another. A quiet, orderly line formed along the track, a pilgrimage of thirsty families. There was no shouting, no panic. There was only a weary, respectful gratitude. Ilara and Finn worked from sunup to sundown. He would guide the wagons in, and she would work the pump, the steady rhythm a counterpoint to the quiet clinking of coins into the metal box she set on a post. People paid what they could. Some paid in coin, others in promises of firewood, sacks of potatoes, or skilled labor. She recorded each transaction in a small ledger, her handwriting neat and precise. She was no longer just a landowner. She was the town's water master, the center of a new and honest economy built not on power, but on a shared and vital need. She became a quiet authority. People started calling her Miss Ilara. They asked her advice about their own dry wells, about their livestock. They saw that her own animals, the 27 fools, were thriving. The donkeys had become symbols of a wisdom the town had forgotten. The wisdom of patience, of listening to the earth, of finding abundance in the most unlikely of places. The drought did not break for another month. For 31 days, the well on the Scrabble sustained the town of Redemption. Ilara's ledger grew thick with names and promises, a document of communal survival. Then, one evening, the brassy sky turned a bruised purple. A cool wind, smelling of rain, swept through the valley. That night the first drops fell, and by morning it had settled into a long, slow, soaking rain that the parched ground drank with a desperate thirst. The river began to rise. The wells began to fill. The crisis was over. The well, however, remained. The townspeople, true to their word, came and helped her shore it up properly, lining it with stone and building a small roof over it. It became a permanent landmark, a testament to what had happened. It was known simply as Donkey Well. Sterling's influence in the town was broken. Humiliated, he sold off much of his herd and grew withdrawn. The fear he had once commanded had been replaced by a quiet contempt. The laughter was gone forever. On a cool afternoon in the new green season, Ilara stood with Mrs. Anna and Finn by the well. The donkeys grazed peacefully in the basin, which was now carpeted in soft, new grass. Finn was leaning against Silas, the big male, scratching his floppy ear. Mrs. Anna looked at the scene, at the clear water, the healthy animals, the secure woman, and the happy boy. She smiled her slow, ancient smile. "You see, child," she said, her voice full of warmth. "The desert remembers the sea. You asked it so nicely, and it answered." Ilara watched her herd, the 27 wise souls who had saved a town. She was not a fool. She was not a victim. She had listened to the quiet language of the world and had found her place within it. Her vindication was not in the coins in her box, but in the gentle sound of trickling water, the contented sigh of a donkey, and the deep, abiding peace of a home she had made in a place no one had ever wanted.